Imagine obliterating an $80,000 Ming Dynasty vase in the office of New York's deadliest crime lord. And instead of catching a bullet, you catch a job offer. Bro, Lila literally crashed her interview, destroyed a $4,000 ivory statue, and Dante Morelli just smirked. Why? Because this desperate math genius didn't just bring him coffee, she uncovered a massive $500,000 betrayal right under his nose. Dante thought he was hiring an admin assistant, but he actually recruited the ultimate secret weapon to dismantle his own underworld empire. Stick around because this office romance just turned into an all-out gang war.
The subject, Lila Bennett, initiated contact with the case's primary figure, Dante Morelli, by breaching a glass partition on her first day of employment, causing a cessation of all activity in the immediate environment. Mr. Morelli is known for his intolerance of deviation. A previous subordinate was removed for a minor clerical error. However, a paradoxical reaction was observed: amusement. What began as a catastrophic failure of decorum involving spilled liquids and destroyed artifacts evolved into a high-risk symbiotic relationship within the city's criminal hierarchy. This file documents their collision of chaotic and controlling pathologies, a dynamic predicted to result in either mutual stabilization or total systemic collapse. The vertical transport to the 47th floor of the Morelli Tower induced a notable visceral response in the subject, Lila. She exhibited guarding behavior, holding a worn portfolio to her chest while observing her reflection in the polished steel, which appeared to trigger symptoms of imposter syndrome. Her attempts at a professional appearance were deteriorating. Strands of her blonde hair escaped their restraints. A discoloration, identified as a coffee stain, was visible on the hem of a navy dress procured for the interview, a detail she attempted to conceal with minimal success. Her distorted reflection received a whispered, self-directed affirmation. "You're fine." "Psndache," she continued a self-calming internal monologue. "The role is rudimentary. An administrative position, standard clerical duties, telecommunications, perhaps basic ledger work. You have overcome greater challenges." The elevator chimed, signaling arrival. The doors opened to a reception space designed with a sterile aesthetic that seemed to reject human comfort. The palette was restricted to black, white, and chrome, with marble flooring that mirrored overhead lighting. The furnishings appeared costly and ergonomically hostile. Seated behind a futuristic console, a female with severe facial features and hair under extreme tension, likely inducing a tension headache, acknowledged her presence. "You are tardy," the woman stated, foregoing standard greetings. Lila consulted her watch. "My arrival is actually 7 minutes ahead of schedule. Mr. Morelli requires attendees 15 minutes prior to a scheduled meeting. You are tardy." The woman's irises, flat and umber, showed no reactivity. "Designation?" "Lila Bennett, I have a 9 a.m. appointment." "Your purpose here is known." The woman rose in a motion that was functionally threatening. She was tall, with an angular build, clad in a black suit whose cost likely exceeded Lila's monthly housing expenditure. "Proceed behind me. Do not interact with any objects. Do not vocalize unless directly addressed by Mr. Morelli. Avert your gaze until he initiates visual contact, and for your own well-being, do not misappropriate his time." Lila processed the commands. "Is this an interview or an interrogation?" The woman's facial expression remained static. With Mr. Morelli, the two are often indistinguishable. They proceeded down a corridor, displaying abstract art of indeterminate value, possibly either a multi-million-dollar collection or an elaborate jest. The pile of the carpet was so deep it impeded her ambulation with each step. Behind closed doors, a palpable tension suggested a workforce operating under duress, a focused silence born from a fear of making any sound. "Apologies," Lila vocalized, a common response to anxiety-induced silence. I did not receive your name. I did not offer it. The woman halted before a set of dark wood double doors with chrome fixtures. This is Mr. Morelli's office. He is engaged in a communication. When the indicator light above the door shifts to green, you are permitted entry. Not a moment sooner. And if the indicator remains unlit, then your state of waiting will persist. For what duration? The woman regarded her as if the question were a fundamental logical error. Until the light turns green, or until a change in Mr. Morelli's schedule dictates your appointment's cancellation, whichever event occurs first. With that, she pivoted and departed, her heels striking the marble with the rhythm of a chronometer. Lila remained isolated, observing the intensely red, active state light. She shifted her stance, rechecking her watch. 9 a.m. precisely. By normative social standards, she was punctual, but not by the metrics of this rigidly controlled environment. Minutes elapsed. The light remained red. A voice permeated the door, deep, measured, exhibiting a control that suggested its owner never had to raise it. Words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. It was not anger, nor was it kindness. It was the sound of irrefutable facts being delivered. Lila experienced somatic discomfort in her feet. The borrowed heels were approximately a half size too small, a substitute for her own footwear, which had suffered a structural failure involving city infrastructure and precipitation. She attempted to redistribute her weight again. The portfolio's mass became noticeable. She placed it on the floor, then immediately retrieved it, as leaving an object the floor of this aggressively sterile facility felt like a transgression. The indicator light shifted to green. Lila actuated the handle and applied pressure. The door was non-compliant. She increased the force. No result. It required pulling, not pushing. A basic mechanical error. She re-engaged, pulled, and the door opened with a momentum that propelled her forward, causing a loss of balance. Her heel snagged in the carpet's edge, and she fell into the room as if propelled from behind. Her portfolio made initial impact. Its contents were ejected. Her curriculum vitae, her letters of reference, and printed spreadsheet exemplars were broadcast across the dark hardwood floor in a disorganized pattern. Lila's body then collided with an object, resulting in a spectacular acoustic event. She processed multiple sensory inputs simultaneously. The sound of fracturing porcelain, the olfactory notes of aged paper and high-end cologne, and the profound silence that followed the destructive act. She was on her hands and knees amid the fragments of what was once a vase. It was not a common vessel, but one of museum quality. Blue and white, its painted scenes now reduced to expensive shards. Negative, Lila whispered, a cascading negative outcome. Assume an upright position. The voice originated from behind a desk of significant size. It was the same voice from the hallway, now with greater clarity. It was calm, unnaturally so. Lila attempted to rise, an action complicated by her compromised footwear and trembling hands. She achieved a vertical state, only to immediately place her foot on a scattered resume page, which acted as a low-friction surface. She stabilized herself by grabbing a bookshelf. This action dislodged another object, a small sculpture, which struck the floor and fractured. "Cease all movement," the voice commanded. Lila froze. Her cardiac rhythm was palpable in her throat. In approximately 15 seconds, she had caused property damage likely valued in thousands of dollars. "My apologies are profound," she stated. "I will provide restitution. The method of restitution is unclear, but I will devise a solution. I can acquire a secondary source of income. I will..." "Direct your gaze toward me." Lila complied, looking up from the debris field. Dante Morelli was seated, exhibiting the stillness of a predator assessing a stimulus as either prey or a novelty. He appeared younger than anticipated, perhaps mid-30s, with dark, sharply defined hair and facial features, suggesting an architect's preference for geometry over emotional warmth. He was attired in a black suit that seemed integrated with his form. He wore no tie, and the top button of his shirt was open, a detail more unsettling than full formal dress would have been. His eyes were dark, not merely brown, but genuinely dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. He observed her as if she were a complex problem being solved in real time. "You are Lila Bennett," he stated, not as an inquiry. "Correct." Her vocalization was diminished. I was present for an interview. I am deeply sorry about the vase." It was a 14th century Ming Dynasty piece, valued at approximately $80,000. Lila experienced a physiological response consistent with shock, including facial pallor. I can arrange a payment schedule." It was also a counterfeit. He inclined his head slightly. "I store the authentic article elsewhere. This office experiences too much traffic for genuine antiquities." She processed this information, so I did not just destroy. "You destroyed a $1,500 reproduction. It is still a significant loss and indicative of carelessness, but not a catastrophe." He rose, and Lila registered his height. Not extreme, but his verticality altered the room's spatial dynamics. "The sculpture you dislodged, however, was authentic, 18th century ivory. You will be compensating me for that." Lila looked down at the new fragments near her feet. "What is its value?" "That will be determined if you survive the next 10 minutes. He rounded his desk, his movements precise and deliberate. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, is the destruction of property a habitual behavior, or is today a unique event?" "This level of disorganization is atypical for me," Lila responded, a statement she immediately identified as defensive and weak. "My assertion is that I am competent. I am organized. I am—" "You are standing in the debris of broken porcelain and your own professional history." He closed the distance between them, stopping near enough for her to observe a minor scar adjacent to his left eyebrow. "You are wearing ill-fitting footwear and a stained garment. Your portfolio's structural integrity appears to depend on hope and a failed zipper. Every visible reference document is marked with a liquid ring stain." Lila felt a rising thermal sensation in her face. "There are explanatory factors." "Do not present them." He crouched, a movement that brought him to her eye level in a manner more disquieting than his standing posture, and retrieved one of her resume pages. He examined it in silence. Subject's profile: a mathematics degree from Columbia, full academic scholarship. Graduated with highest honors. 3 years of experience in financial analysis at Meridian Hecht, preceding its dissolution last year. He observed her. "Why pursue an administrative assistant role when you possess qualifications exceeding half the management positions in this structure?" "Because I require employment," Lila stated with clinical honesty. "And no entity will engage a person whose former employer was indicted for fraud, despite my lack of involvement. You were in their accounting division. I was in data analysis. I located the irregularities and escalated them. Subsequently, the FBI uncovered greater discrepancies, and the entire enterprise failed." She held his gaze, a behavior consistent with the subject who perceives they have nothing further to lose. "I performed the correct action, and it terminated my career. I am now rebuilding, and evidently I am initiating this by wrecking your office. A shift registered in Dante's expression. It was not a softening. His presentation did not suggest a capacity for such, but a change indicating the confirmation of a hypothesis. You reported the fraudulent activity, he stated. Yes, with full knowledge it would jeopardize your position. I reported it because human subjects were facing the loss of their retirement savings if action was not taken. Lila noted an increase in her own vocal amplitude. A dangerous sign of emotional dysregulation she seemed unable to control. I did not foresee the organization's total collapse. I operated under the assumption it would be corrected. I was mistaken. Dante stood, her file still in his hand. And your current state is one of insolvency, unemployability, and a desperation sufficient to make you work for me. I investigated your corporation, Lila stated. Morelli Enterprises controls 17 subsidiary entities, 6 commercial properties, and has a documented pattern of aggressive expansion with unblemished accounting records. Publicly, you maintain a legitimate operation. Publicly, Dante reiterated, a trace of what could be interpreted as clinical amusement in his voice. It could have been. I require a job, Lila repeated. I am proficient in my function. I exhibit high attention to detail. I am rapid. And I do not pose questions to which I do not require answers. That last component is a fabrication. You have already posed questions to my receptionist. I inquired about her name, which she did not provide, as her designated function is not to form social bonds. He moved back toward his desk, demonstrating an ability to navigate the field of broken ceramic without downward visual confirmation. I have employed 4 administrative assistants in the last 2 years. One resigned after 3 days. A second developed a nervous condition within a week. The third made the error of tardiness on 2 occasions. The fourth attempted theft. What was their disposition? The initial 3 secured alternative employment. The fourth is no longer a variable of concern. He sat gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Be seated. Layla assessed the chair, then the wreckage separating her from it. She navigated the floor with caution, consciously avoiding further contact with debris, and seated herself. The chair's discomfort level was precisely as anticipated. Dante accessed a desk drawer and produced a thin file. I will present you with 3 questions. Respond with complete honesty. If I detect deception, this assessment will conclude, and your prospects for employment in this city will be permanently nullified. Is that understood? Layla experienced sudden xerostomia. Understood. First question. What was the true motivation for your presence here today? I told you You require a job, yes, but you have submitted applications to 43 companies over the last 6 months. I am aware of this because I commissioned a full credit and background report on you yesterday. He reclined in his chair. 37 of those submissions were for roles analogous to your previous one. 5 were lateral. Only this one represented a significant professional regression. So I will ask again, why here? Layla regulated her breathing. The truth, or a fabrication? She was reasonably certain he could differentiate. Because all other entities review my resume and classify me as either incompetent or criminal, she said. The association with fraud negated my candidacy preemptively, but your organization has a reputation for acquiring assets that other companies discard. You employ 3 executives from failed corporations. You hired a woman with 6 prior terminations. This suggests either an unusual capacity for forgiveness or a disregard for conventional hiring metrics. or that I prioritize competence over credentials. That is also a possibility. Lila met his gaze. I am hypothesizing that you are the type of individual who evaluates subjects based on their utility, not on the actions of others. Dante remained silent for a moment. Then, second question, what was the actual reason for the collapse of Moretti and Hecht? The fraud investigation. That is the public rationale. What is the real one? Lila paused. This registered as a test, but the desired response was unclear. The fraud was a real variable, she said deliberately, but it was not the complete etiology. Moretti had leveraged significant debt to finance expansion when the investigation froze their capital. They defaulted on payroll. This initiated a cascading failure. Clients withdrew, creditors demanded payment, and the entire structure disintegrated in 3 weeks. The fraud ignited the accelerant, but the company was already saturated with it. You foresaw this outcome. It was a statement, not a question, but Lila responded nonetheless. I identified the pattern 6 months prior to the event. I reported it through internal channels. I was ignored. For what reason? Because I was a 26-year-old subject telling executives twice my age that their operational model was terminally flawed. They assessed my prognosis as melodrama. Lila detected the bitterness in her own vocal tone and attempted to suppress it. Their assessment was incorrect. Mine was correct. The outcome was unaffected by these facts. Dante took a pen from his desk and depressed the clicker once. The sound was acute in the quiet room. Third question. If I employ you and you discover irregularities in my company's financials, what is your projected course of action? This was the primary evaluation. Lila understood this. I would report it to you, she said directly, and then I would assist you in rectifying it. Not to external authorities. Not unless you instructed me to. Lila leaned forward marginally. I assimilated the lesson from the Moretti case. Bypassing the command structure does not resolve a problem. It merely induces chaos. If my function is to serve you, I serve you, not the FBI, not the SEC, not any other entity. That is either loyalty or a flexible moral framework. It is pragmatism, Lila stated. I cannot correct systemic issues from an external position. I can only correct them if I am granted sufficient trust to operate from within. Dante clicked the pen again, once, twice. He then placed it down, aligning it perfectly with his notebook's edge. You begin on Monday, he said. 800 hours. 8 sharp. Not 8:15, not 7:45. 800 precisely. Lila felt a release of somatic tension in her chest. Thank you, I will not. Your compensation will be $60,000 annually. Health benefits commence after 90 days. Your reporting line is directly to me, which means your work duration will exceed that of any other individual in this building, and you will process information that could expose you to risk if compromised. You will not discuss my business operations externally. You will not inquire about functions that do not concern you, and under no circumstances will you break any other objects in my office. I understand. You will execute a non-disclosure agreement so thorough your legal counsel will advise against it. You will execute it anyway because your need for this job supersedes your need for legal protection. He stood. The ivory artifact you destroyed was valued at $4,000. I will garnish it from your first 3 pay cycles. The vase was my error. Placing a replica in a high-traffic zone was a flawed decision. We will consider that matter closed. Lila also rose, attempting to mask the physiological signs of relief on her face. Thank you, Mr. Moretti. Do not thank me yet. You have not yet survived 1 full operational day. He walked to the door and opened it. Claire will transmit the employment documents, review all materials, sign nothing until you are certain. Claire, my receptionist, the woman whose name you requested. Right. Lila collected her dispersed documents, attempting to preserve a degree of composure while retrieving items from the floor. She successfully consolidated everything into her portfolio, though a compromised zipper required her to secure it with both hands. As she neared the doorway, Dante spoke again. Ms. Bennett, she turned. The primary reason for your hiring is not your credentials or your desperation, he said. It is because you reported the fraud at Moretti, despite knowing it would result in a total loss for you. Most individuals lack that level of fortitude. I require a subject who possesses it. Layla could not formulate a verbal response, so she simply nodded and departed. The weekend was a period of heightened anxiety and preparation. Layla acquired new footwear, professional-grade shoes that fit correctly, and 2 additional dresses without visible blemishes. She reviewed the non-disclosure agreement Claire had emailed, all 47 pages of it, and signed it, because Dante's assessment had been accurate. Her need for this position was greater than her need for legal protections. Monday commenced with precipitation. Layla stood outside Moretti Tower at 7:45, holding an umbrella that had already inverted once from the wind, observing the building as it loomed like a monument to psychological dominance. The lobby consisted of marble and steel, with security personnel who inspected identification as if guarding fissile materials. She arrived on the 47th floor at 7:58. Claire was at her station, presenting the same severe demeanor as during the interview. She glanced at Layla, then at the chronometer on her monitor. You are early. I believed early was considered on time in this environment. Early is permissible. On time is required. Late is a terminal condition. Claire provided her with a key card and a slim file. Your workstation is in the alcove adjacent to Mr. Moretti's office. You are cleared from the 47th floor, the executive conference room on 46, and the records archive on 42. Access to any other area requires written approval. Your computer login is in the file. Alter the password without delay. Mr. Morelli will arrive at 800 hours. He requires coffee, black, no sugar, at a temperature between 180 and 185 degrees, on his desk at 8:01. Not 800, not 8:02. Where do I? Claire indicated a door labeled Executive Break Room. There is a thermometer in the drawer beside the espresso machine. Utilize it. Subject Lila, clutching the provided dossier and access card, proceeded to the designated nutrition area, a space more akin to a temple of high-end machinery than a common room. The coffee apparatus appeared engineered for extraterrestrial deployment. Securing a thermal gauge, she prepared the beverage, confirmed its temperature with obsessive precision, and presented it at Dante's workstation at precisely 1 minute past 8. The office was unoccupied. Lila placed the offering with deliberate care, maintaining a safe perimeter from valuable artifacts, before withdrawing to her assigned post. The workspace, though compact, was a model of ergonomic logic. Her station provided a cityscape vista, a view that undoubtedly commanded a premium. A terminal, a telecommunication device of superfluous complexity, and a pile of dossiers marked for immediate action awaited her. Lila initiated her work sequence, accessing the system and examining the primary document. The record was a freight manifest from a Morelli-owned entity presenting as routine logistical data. Upon comparison with the firm's stated assets, a minor incongruity emerged. A textile consignment scheduled for 500 units was recorded as 487. The variance was acknowledged, but lacked justification. Lila accessed a second manifest. Same corporation, different fiscal period. Yet another small deficit of 13 units. She began constructing a pattern analysis model. A voice interjected, "You have been present for 20 minutes and already you are engaged in pathology detection." The subject exhibited a startled response. Dante was positioned at his office entrance, holding the beverage she had prepared. His facial expression lacked mirth, but suggested a degree of clinical approval. "I am merely examining the dossiers you designated as priority," Lila stated. "Those documents are 6 months old. They are not a priority. They are an evaluation." He sampled the coffee. 184 degrees. Satisfactory. Did you measure the temperature? I measure everything. He approached her workstation to observe her monitor. "Your findings?" "Minor inventory variances in all shipments from Arcadia Textiles. Insignificant individually, but persistent. The etiology is either systemic malfunction or deliberate malfeasance." "Which diagnosis do you favor?" "A random system error would produce stochastic results. This pattern is too uniform. An individual is systematically misappropriating small quantities, operating under the assumption that minor deficits will be disregarded." Dante placed his cup on her desk. "What is the aggregate financial impact?" Lila displayed her rapid analysis. Over 6 months, an estimated $32,000 in assets based on wholesale valuation. "The perpetrator?" White data. "Identifying the individual would require access to personnel files and logistics timetables. The profile suggests a warehouse operative with clearance to alter inventory records." "You have occupied this station for 20 minutes, Dante observed softly. "My previous subordinate failed to identify this anomaly in 6 months of reviewing the same data." "Perhaps your previous subordinate was not conditioned to recognize patterns." "She was tasked with precisely this. I instructed her." He retrieved his coffee. "The variable is competence. She lacked it. You possess it." The subject experienced a brief elevation in self-esteem, immediately counteracted by distrust. "You were already aware of the variances." "I have been aware for 8 months. This was an experiment to measure your detection latency." "That is?" Lila truncated a response that would likely result in immediate termination. "That is remarkably meticulous." "I do not retain untested personnel, nor do I extend trust without empirical validation." He moved toward his office, then halted. "Rectified the Arcadia situation. Discreetly, the subject must remain unaware of his exposure until I determine a course of action." "What is your preferred method?" "Your intellect was sufficient to diagnose the pathology. It should be sufficient to devise a cure." He vanished behind his door. Lila observed the closed portal, then refocused on her terminal. She summoned personnel files, delivery timetables, and warehouse ingress records. 3 hours of data correlation and temporal reconstruction yielded a positive identification. Marcus Renton, a warehouse supervisor with 6 years of service and credentials for the inventory system. The subject's modus operandi involved altering inventory counts post-loading but pre-documentation, a method that disguised the theft as statistical noise. Lila composed a concise summary with corroborating data, placing it on Dante's desk during his absence. Upon his return, he reviewed the document wordlessly before summoning her. "Your certainty." "Barring an exceptionally sophisticated frame, the conclusion is sound." "Prescribe a treatment." Lila paused. "Terminate his employment and notify law enforcement." "Justification." "He is misappropriating your assets." He has misappropriated $32,000 over 6 months, approximately $5,000 per month. Are you aware of my monthly expenditure on office beverages? I would hypothesize it exceeds $5,000. Substantially more. Therefore, why is this relevant? Lila processed this. Because the issue is not fiscal, it is psychological. Permitting such behavior without reprisal encourages systemic contagion. Improved? Dante reclined. Further analysis? If he is converting inventory, he has a distribution channel. This implies a vulnerability in your supply chain, one that could be leveraged for more damaging breaches than textiles. The core diagnosis. Dante rose. Marcus Renton is irrelevant to me. My concern is with the systemic weakness that enabled his actions for 8 months undetected. Repair the system. Methodology. Institute a validation protocol, stochastic inspections, and a 2-factor authorization for record modifications. Engineer the system so that compliance requires less effort than subversion. He moved to the window. Then terminate Renton. No law enforcement, no theatrics, I will manage the remainder. The subject experienced a physiological cold response. What does manage the remainder entail? Dante pivoted to face her. It entails refraining from inquiries to which you do not wish to know the answers. She considered objecting, but recalled her commitment from the initial interview. I serve your interests. I will deploy the new protocols this week, she stated. Excellent. He returned to his desk. And Ms. Bennett? Yes. Do not permit Marcus Renton to occupy your thoughts. I assure you, he will cease to be a variable. Lila exited, returned to her station, and made a conscious effort to suppress all speculation on the statement's meaning. The subsequent weeks instituted a routine characterized by a duality of high productivity and profound disquiet. Subject Lila adhered to a strict 7:55 arrival, preparing Dante's beverage to exact thermal specifications. Her duties involved resolving issues spanning from routine clerical functions to intricate fiscal dissections, seemingly engineered to probe the boundaries of her cognitive and emotional endurance. Dante's expectations were clinically severe. He required not just task completion, but flawless, optimized execution under deliberately engineered adverse conditions. He would present assignments with incomplete data, expecting autonomous acquisition or demand analysis of an unspecified nature, only to censure her for failing to anticipate his unstated hypothesis. Despite this, intermittent episodes occurred, where he would examine her work and offer a minimal nod, a gesture she decoded as equivalent to fulsome praise from a normative individual. There were instances when he solicited her professional opinion and appeared to process her response. At times, she observed him studying her with an expression that registered as neither approbation nor rejection. The work environment was anomalous. Personnel navigated the facility with extreme caution, employing hushed tones and evading direct visual contact in vertical transport. She had overheard fragmented narratives about Dante, ranging from the credible to the fantastical. One theory posited he was a self-made magnate. An alternate account suggested he was the scion of a predecessor who was reputedly more severe. The consensus held that opposing him was, at minimum, a professionally fatal error, with more dire outcomes being plausible. Lila actively suppressed these thoughts, focusing on her professional efficacy as a primary coping strategy. She rectified system errors, optimized workflows, and intercepted faults pre-crisis. She developed a capacity for anticipating Dante's requirements, interpreting his affective state from micro-expressions, and navigating his structured turmoil without succumbing to it. Then, 6 weeks into her tenure, she discovered an artifact outside her designated purview. It was late, almost 8 p.m. The facility was largely depopulated, but Dante remained in conference, and Lila was processing a queue of expenditure records flagged for audit. The data was mundane: travel, client relations, asset procurement. However, one entry presented as illogical. An entity named Meridian Holdings filed an expense for $127,000 in consultation services. This in itself was not anomalous. Yet when Lila accessed Meridian's fiscal history for verification, a discrepancy appeared. The payment was directed to Apex Advisory Group, an unknown firm, suggesting it was either a new venture or too minor for standard corporate registries. A query yielded negative results. Apex Advisory Group was a non-entity, lacking legal registration, tax records, or a corporate footprint. It was a phantom. The subject's heart rate accelerated. The finding pointed to either a data entry mistake or a significant pathology. She retrieved additional records from Meridian. 3 further disbursements to Apex were documented over the preceding 6 months, each ranging from $100,000 to $150,000. Over $500,000 had been transferred to a non-existent firm. A review of Meridian's other expenditures revealed no irregularities. These 4 transactions were stark aberrations in an otherwise clean ledger. Lila remained motionless, her focus locked on the data display. The subject, Lila, observed a clear, systemic aberration. Funds diverted through Meridian indicated either unauthorized internal malfeasance or a directed corporate pathology. If the dominant male, Dante, was complicit, her discovery placed her in a position of extreme vulnerability. The logical course was to retreat. Instead, she exhibited a compulsive need to probe deeper. An examination of Meridian's shipping records, a logistical entity, commenced. Cross-referencing manifests with financial data revealed a pattern of dysfunction. Falsified inventories, illogical transit routes, and dormant yet operational warehouse listings. The initial diagnosis of fraud was insufficient. The subject experienced an acute stress response. Her superior, Dante, materialized in the doorway, displaying signs of fatigue atypical for his presentation. His query, "Find anything interesting?" presented a critical inflection point. This moment would determine the subsequent trajectory of their dynamic. Deception offered self-preservation. Disclosure, however, presented an opportunity to diagnose the true nature of the man. Lila chose confrontation, reorienting her monitor to present the incriminating data. She presented her findings clinically. Meridian Holdings shows payments to a non-existent entity totaling over $500,000 in 6 months. The fund's destination is untraceable without direct access to Meridian's banking. Dante approached her station, his affect unreadable as he observed the screen. "And what do you think that means?" His tone was measured. "I assess it as internal theft, money laundering, or a combination," Lila stated. "Or it is a known operation, and my presence is an unintended complication." A significant pause followed before Dante closed the file on her screen. "Go home, Ms. Bennett." His directive was not aggressive, but carefully controlled. "We will address this tomorrow." After securing her data, Lila departed under his perceived observation, though his office door was closed upon her final glance. Sleep was unattainable. She returned at 7:30 the next morning, anticipating access denial, a standard corporate termination protocol. Instead, normalcy prevailed. The elevator ascended to the 47th floor. Her system access was unimpeded. A light from under Dante's door indicated his presence. The subject prepared his coffee, a ritualistic offering, verifying its temperature twice before knocking at precisely 8:01. Kommen. Dante stood at the window, his posture suggesting intense contemplation of the urban sprawl below. He did not turn. "Set it on the desk," he instructed. As Lila attempted to withdraw, he commanded, "Stay." She froze, her autonomic nervous system registering a state of high alert. Dante turned, his fatigue now a distinct clinical sign. Yet it seemed to enhance his imposing demeanor. "Report your findings," he ordered. Layla recited the data with practiced detachment. Payments to a shell corporation via Meridian Holdings, exceeding $500,000 in 6 months. Logistical irregularities suggest warehouses are used for undisclosed purposes. My assessment is either an unsanctioned operation is occurring or you are directing it. If the latter, I require clarification of my position. Dante moved to his desk, sipped the coffee, and placed it with exacting precision. The subject's environment was weaponized. Every element projected control. "Sit," he said, indicating the same chair from her initial evaluation. "What is your knowledge of my family?" Dante inquired. "Your father founded Morelli Enterprises 30 years ago. He passed 8 years ago, at which point you assumed control and initiated significant expansion." "My father did not start a business," Dante corrected, his tone devoid of emotion. "He inherited an empire. My grandfather established operations that rendered him powerful and feared. My father succeeded him. Upon my father's death, the responsibility transferred to my brother and me." A physiological cold response was noted in the subject. "Operations?" "Your cognitive abilities are sufficient. I will not elaborate." "Your family is engaged in organized crime." "Is," Dante affirmed. "Present tense, though a transition is underway. Some assets are now legitimate. Others are being sanitized. Meridian, however, still serves its original function." "You are laundering money." "I am managing an inherited pathology. There is a distinction." He manipulated a pen, a self-soothing gesture. "Upon my father's death, the choice was binary. Abandon the structure to implode, or seize control and attempt to forge a legitimate entity to protect my dependents. I chose the latter." "What is your purpose in telling me this?" "Your discovery makes you either a tool or a threat. I am affording you the opportunity to choose your classification." The subject reported xerostomia. "And if I choose to disengage?" "You will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, receive a substantial severance, and find your career in this city terminated. You will be labeled a security risk." "That is not a choice." "No," Dante conceded. "It is not. It is, however, more agency than is typically granted in your circumstances." Layla analyzed the dominant figure who had offered her a function when she felt obsolete. He was presenting a role within a system that could result in her destruction or an opportunity to be instrumental in a complex, dangerous, and illicit transformation. "What would my function be?" she asked. A subtle shift in Dante's expression was observed. Not relief, but approximate state. "Your current function, amplified. Identify systemic problems and engineer solutions. Assist me in legitimizing the enterprise before its foundational corruption destroys us." This exceeds an administrative assistant's role. "You have been performing forensic accounting and operational analysis since your first day. I merely withheld the nomenclature and anomalies like Meridian. You report them directly to me. Together, We devise strategies to resolve them without triggering a systemic collapse. I will not deceive you about the nature of this organization, but your ethical boundaries will be respected. You must decide now if you will integrate. Lila recalled past experiences where ethical action resulted in catastrophic failure. She weighed her professional stagnation at 27 against this high-risk opportunity. I require full access to all financial records, she stipulated, not just curated files. To sanitize the system, I must see the entire pathology. Agreed? And I require your assurance that legitimacy is the true objective, not a pretext to conceal evidence. Dante rose and circumnavigated the desk, offering his hand. You have my word. In my world, that is a binding instrument. Lila reciprocated the gesture. The physical contact was firm and prolonged, sealing a pact beyond a standard business arrangement. Welcome to the inner circle, Ms. Bennett, he said, attempt to limit collateral damage. In subsequent weeks, Lila found Dante's world was a far more complex organism than initial observation suggested. She gained access to encrypted systems and financial records that illustrated an organization undergoing a painful, protracted metamorphosis. Some subsidiaries were entirely legitimate, conducting business precisely as advertised. Others were in flux, their revenue streams redirected, partnerships dissolved, and structures overhauled. Then there were entities like Meridian. Layla's days were spent tracing funds through labyrinthine networks, deciding which ventures to salvage and which to liquidate. It felt like unknotting a massive tangle as someone kept feeding in more line, each pull revealing a new complication. To her surprise, Dante was beside her for much of it. She assumed he would manage from afar, issuing directives from his office while she handled the grimy details. Instead, he would sit at her desk, poring over files with her, dissecting problems as a colleague, not a boss. This Brooklyn warehouse, Layla noted one afternoon, tapping a property file on her monitor. It's on the books as a Meridian storage site, but the utility bills are off. It's drawing far more electricity than a simple warehouse should. Dante leaned in to see her screen. He was so near, she caught the scent of his cologne, a subtle, expensive aroma with a French name she wouldn't dare try to pronounce. What's your theory on its use? He asked. Either they're running unlisted machinery, or it's being repurposed for something power-intensive. Maybe a grow house, or some kind of fabrication plant. Neither. It's a casino, poker, sportsbook with some loan sharking on the side. Dante leaned back. My uncle's venture. He's run it for 20 years. Your uncle? My father's brother. He has zero interest in going clean, and he holds enough sway in the family that ousting him would ignite a conflict I can't afford right now. Layla accessed more files. What's the annual take from this place? Around $2 million in profit, almost none of it declared. No. And you're allowing it to continue. I'm choosing my fights. The gambling den is small enough to fly under federal radar. My uncle keeps it contained, avoids expansion, and doesn't get greedy. It's a liability, but a manageable one. I have more pressing fires to extinguish first. Such as? Dante rose and moved to the window, a habit he had when deep in thought, as if the cityscape helped him structure his ideas. Such as my father making commitments to men who don't care that he is deceased, or that I have suppliers pushing me to traffic products I want to abandon, or the fact that terminating certain agreements would paint a target on me so large that running a legitimate enterprise would be impossible. What kind of products? He pivoted to face her. Are you certain you want to know? Layla considered it. Yes, mainly stolen merchandise, premium electronics, gems, fine art, items that enter the port and vanish before customs can log them. My father cultivated relationships with acquisition specialists, and they expect that business to carry on. Is it? For the moment. I have been slowly winding down our role, purchasing less, distributing less, creating space. But the process is delicate and fraught with peril. These are not individuals who take kindly to being cut out. Layla swiveled back to her monitor, pulling up manifests. Show me the operations involved. I'll see if I can find a way to justify the downturn with legitimate causes. Make it appear driven by market dynamics, not by choice. Dante came back to her desk, and for the next 2 hours, he guided her through the illicit side of his empire. He spoke factually, without apology or defensiveness, simply presenting the reality he inherited and was attempting to dismantle. When he concluded, Layla's head throbbed, and she finally understood why he had looked so drained when she first reported the meridian discrepancies. This will take years, she stated. I'm aware, and there's no assurance it will succeed. Any of these alliances could implode and bring the entire structure down. I know that as well. Dante studied her. Does this alter your position? About assisting you? Layla shook her head. No, but it means our strategy has to be more intelligent. We must accelerate in some areas and decelerate in others. We need to prioritize by risk, not by profit. What would your priority list be? Layla opened a fresh spreadsheet and began to construct a framework. First, any operation involving violence or human exploitation is terminated, regardless of its earnings. We can't claim legitimacy while profiting from human suffering. Second, are any ventures attracting police notice? They are ticking bombs. Third, the high-risk, low-return operations not worth the potential blowback. Everything else gets phased out slowly, replaced with legitimate income streams as we proceed. Dante observed her work, and when she glanced up, his expression was unreadable. What? She inquired. You've just stepped into organized crime, and your immediate reaction is to create an ethical disassembly plan. You said you wanted to operate above board. That requires standards. Most people in your shoes would be finding an angle to profit from this. I'm not most people. Layla saved the file. And if I were interested in profiting from illicit activities, I wouldn't have flagged the fraud at Morrison. No, Dante agreed softly. You wouldn't have. He departed from her office then, but the following morning, Layla saw her salary had risen by $30,000, and her title was now Director of Financial Operations. The job engrossed her like nothing had since her first years at Morrison. She was solving puzzles with real stakes, working with someone who saw her as a partner, not a subordinate. The hours were punishing. 12 to 14-hour days became the norm. But she didn't complain. She was in her element. This was her calling. And Dante, despite his control and guarded demeanor, was evolving into something more than her employer. She saw it in small gestures like the coffee he'd bring her when he knew she'd been staring at numbers too long, or how he'd solicit her thoughts on topics unrelated to work, books, music, the buzz around a new restaurant on Fifth Avenue, or how he'd sometimes just sit in her office, working quietly, as if her presence was a comfort. She saw it in his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking, a look that mingled curiosity with something akin to concern. 3 months in, Layla was working late on a complex shipping route analysis when Dante materialized in her doorway with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that likely cost more than her first car. Time for a break, he stated. I'm nearly finished with this. You've been nearly finished for 3 hours. It's time. Layla saved her file and took the glass he offered. The whiskey was smooth, warm, with notes of smoke and honey. To what are we drinking? She asked. To progress. We shut down the first high-priority target today, the port-import scheme. That wasn't scheduled until next month. I expedited it. You were correct. The risk was too great. Dante took the seat opposite her desk. The parties involved were displeased, but they will adapt. How displeased? Displeased enough that I've assigned you a security detail for the next 2 weeks. Layla placed her glass on the desk. I'm sorry. The people we just cut off know you're the analyst who flagged them as a liability. They won't do anything rash, but I won't gamble with your safety. Did it not occur to you to run this by me first? I'm running it by you now. After the fact? Correct. Dante sipped his drink. Because had I asked, you would have insisted you didn't require protection, I would have countered, and we'd have wasted time on a debate that ends with me doing exactly this anyway. That is... Layla paused because he was right and they both knew it. I don't appreciate being handled as if I'm helpless. I'm handling you as if you are vital to this company, and I cannot risk losing you. There's a distinction. Is there? Dante leaned in. I've had 4 executive assistants in 2 years. 3 left, unable to cope with the demands, and 1 attempted to embezzle from me. You have been here for 3 months and have unearthed issues that have been draining this organization for years. You have designed transition strategies my own finance people couldn't conceive. You have questioned my judgment and have been right more often than not, so yes, there is a distinction. I require you here, which means I require you to be safe. Layla lifted her glass again, needing something to do with her hands. I appreciate the sentiment, but I still prefer being consulted. Duly noted. A corner of Dante's mouth lifted slightly, the nearest he typically got to a full smile. I will endeavor to recall that observation should your survival become precarious. Ensure you do. They observed a period of functional silence, consuming premium spirits while viewing the urban landscape from her office. May I pose an inquiry? Layla initiated. The allowance depends upon the question. You indicated a sibling was to co-inherit this enterprise. What was his fate? The subject's facial muscles became rigid. He is deceased. My apologies. It was not my intent. He was terminated 5 years ago in a territorial conflict with a competing syndicate. Dante focused his gaze on his glass. His designated role was to manage the legitimate business sector. He possessed an aptitude for interpersonal dynamics, for negotiation, for forging alliances not predicated on coercion. My function was to oversee the alternate facets, the enforcement, the operations, elements demanding an individual capable of unhesitating, difficult choices. Yet his death resulted in your dual inheritance. His death meant I assumed a domain for which I was only 50% prepared. The violent component I comprehended. The aspect of construction rather than mere preservation was his proficiency, not my own. Layla processed this data. She considered the subject Dante, so meticulously controlled and precise, attempting to construct a legitimate entity using instruments designed for violence. Your progress exceeds your self-assessment, she stated. Does it? You retained my services. You are integrating analysis rather than relying solely on decisions rooted in power and intimidation. You are ceasing operations that inflict harm despite their profitability. This is not indicative of an individual failing to build a legitimate structure. It indicates an individual making a genuine attempt. Dante observed her for a protracted moment. Your confidence in me surpasses my own. Then my presence serves as a necessary counterbalance. A micro-expression resembling a smile appeared, briefly. Then his device vibrated, fracturing the moment. He assessed the screen, and the visible data caused his expression to harden into a more severe state. I must depart, he announced, rising. Do not extend your work hours excessively. What is your destination? Addressing an individual displeased with our recent operational adjustments. He placed his glass upon her desk. The security detail will be positioned outside upon your exit. Do not attempt to evade them. The thought would not occur to me, Lila replied, a statement of falsehood understood by both parties. Following his departure, she remained alone, finished her whiskey, and attempted to suppress rumination on the fact that Dante was entering a hazardous situation while she was secure within a protected building. The following morning, he presented at the office with abraded knuckles and offered no explanation. Lila did not inquire, but she noted his more guarded movements, his use of the left hand over his right to hold a coffee cup, the minor edema on one side of his jaw. She also registered a shift in the tone of office vocalizations. Fear was a prior condition, but its current manifestation was different. Deferential, as if a shift had occurred within the organization's unwritten power structure. What transpired last night? She asked Claire during Dante's meeting. Mr. Morelli provided a reminder as to why his patients should not be tested, Claire stated without diverting her gaze from her monitor. That is the full extent of your need to know. Was there significant injury? Define significant. Claire, the senior woman, finally looked up, her expression containing a trace of sympathy. You are forming an attachment to him. This is an error in judgment. I am not. You are. I have observed 4 assistants in this role. The initial 3 were terrified of him. Stelte. The 4th believed she could exert control over him. You are the first to perceive him as a human being. Claire's vocal tone was low. He is human, yet he is also a threat. Do not forget which attribute holds more weight in this environment. Layla returned to her station, attempting to focus on her tasks, but Claire's words persisted. That evening, after the office had largely emptied, Dante summoned her. A discussion regarding Meridian is required, he stated. Layla took a seat. What is the issue? I am initiating a complete shutdown. The operation presents too many vulnerabilities for insufficient legitimate return. The assets will be liquidated and reallocated to more stable subsidiaries. This will create a deficit in your distribution infrastructure. I will fill it via legitimate contracts. It is a time-consuming process, but a cleaner alternative to a piecemeal transition of Meridian. The timeline? End of the month. This provides you with 3 weeks to devise a redistribution of legitimate functions and sever all other connections. But he moved a folder across the desk. This contains all necessary documentation, employee contracts, vendor agreements, property leases. Your task is to find termination methods that avoid legal exposure or retaliatory action. Layla opened the folder, her initial scan revealing a complex web of interconnected and informal agreements that would be profoundly difficult to cleanly resolve. This task requires a longer time frame than 3 weeks, she observed. I am aware. Execute what is possible. I will manage the remainder. When you state you will manage the remainder, I mean I will manage it through methods you do not need to be privy to. Dante's tone was resolute. I recognize your desire for total involvement, but certain aspects of this business are compartmentalized for your protection and for mine. Layla felt the impulse to argue, but perceived from his expression that it would be futile. His decision was made, and, like the majority of his decisions, it was irreversible. Understood, she said. However, if this fails due to incomplete information on my part, the responsibility is yours. Noted. She took the folder, and for the next 2 weeks, she constructed exit strategies for every contract tied to Meridian. Some were simple, involving leases with standard termination clauses or vendor agreements allowing for cancellation. Others demanded creative solutions, identifying legal grounds for breach, proposing settlements sufficient to prevent litigation, and fabricating documentation trails to withstand legal review. She worked late nightly, often until the maintenance staff began their shifts. Dante also typically worked late, sometimes appearing in her office around 9 or 10 o'clock with sustenance, and they would work in a parallel, comfortable silence. On the evening before the Meridian closure was scheduled to be finalized, Dante appeared at her door, his affect more strained than she had previously observed. We have a complication, he said. A visceral sense of dread manifested in Layla. What type of complication? The type wherein a party becomes aware of the Meridian closure prematurely and elects to take action. He approached her desk. I require you to return to your residence immediately. What is occurring? Nothing that requires your participation. Go home, secure your doors, and do not respond to unrecognized contact attempts. Dante, this is not a negotiation, Layla. His use of her given name was a rare anomaly. Certain individuals are highly displeased with our current changes, and they have chosen tonight to express that displeasure. I need you in a secure location while I address it. I can assist. You cannot. Not in this matter. He accessed his phone and sent a message. Security is positioned downstairs. They will escort you home and remain outside your building until I issue an all clear. What is the expected duration? Whatever time is required. He looked at her, and his eyes displayed an emotion resembling fear, a fact that terrified her, as Dante Morelli did not exhibit fear. Please, for once, comply with my request without resistance. Layla collected her belongings and allowed security to escort her home. Sleep was not possible. She remained on her couch, phone in hand, anticipating a communication that did not arrive. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she was still awake, fixated on her phone, actively suppressing worst-case scenarios. At 2:47, her phone rang. An unknown number, she answered. Miss Bennett? The voice was male, unfamiliar, with an unidentifiable accent. Your actions have created difficulties for certain influential individuals. Who is this? An individual who suggests you reevaluate your professional affiliations. Mr. Morelli's plans are creating a disruption to established systems. Your assistance in this disruption makes you a liability. Layla's grip on the phone intensified. If you have an issue with our actions, address it with Dante. Oh, we are. At this very moment, in fact. but we wish to ensure you comprehend that your participation has consequences. Consider carefully if your employment with Mr. Morelli is worth the potential cost." The connection was severed. Lila remained motionless for a moment before calling Dante. The call went directly to voicemail. A second attempt yielded the same result. She called the security team stationed outside. There was no answer. She seized her keys and phone and fled. The warehouse was located in an urban sector that appeared arrested in its development. Fractured pavement, corroded fencing, and buildings with vacant, broken windows. Layla occupied the passenger seat of Dante's vehicle, a black sedan with a more potent presence of intimidation than a sports car, and focused on regulating her respiration. "This is a tactical error," she stated for the third time since their departure from the office. Dante offered a curt acknowledgement, his attention fixed on the derelict 3-story building ahead. The timing of the confrontation 3 hours prior demonstrates his control-oriented pathology. He approached the subordinate Lila with a predetermined course of action, rendering debate futile. He presented the excursion to the Meridian warehouse as a non-negotiable imperative. Her compliance was secured by leveraging her fear of uncertainty, a textbook manipulation tactic symptomatic of her developing trauma bond. Proximity to the location, which mirrored settings of violent media, induced a state of anxiety in Lila, prompting her to reevaluate her submission. She requested clarity. Dante provided a cryptic, one-word response. He then issued a protocol designed to reinforce dependency, maintain proximity, remain silent, and flee if a threat emerged. His forceful repetition of the flight command solidified the power dynamic. Lila's obedience, a response to perceived environmental threats, was predictable. Dante accessed the premises with practiced ease. The warehouse interior presented sensory indicators of decay and neglect. Overhead lighting cast a jaundiced, unsettling glow, amplifying auditory stimuli like their footsteps. An individual, Gerald, exhibited surprise at the unannounced presence of Mr. Morelli. Dante's tone was affable, yet it triggered a palpable stress response in Layla. He introduced his assistant, noting her forensic accounting role. Gerald's feigned composure was noted in the disconnect between his smile and his eyes. The subject, Bennett, had identified financial anomalies tied to a shell corporation, Apex Advisory. When confronted, Gerald initially affirmed familiarity, classifying the entity as a logistics consultant. Dante then revealed Apex Advisory as a non-existent corporate fiction, presenting two logical conclusions. Either payments were made to a ghost entity, or funds were being laundered. This revelation caused a significant physiological stress response in Gerald, evidenced by his pallor. His verbal defense faltered. Dante then presented his ultimatum, outlining his demands for a full confession regarding the money's destination and unauthorized warehouse activities. When Gerald hesitated, Dante employed a sudden act of physical intimidation, striking the desk to elicit a fear response in both Gerald and Layla. The subject went silent. Dante revealed his long-standing awareness of the fraud, shifting the focus of the interrogation to identifying the operation's mastermind. Under duress, Gerald's resolve collapsed. The subject confessed, implicating Victor Raines as the orchestrator who initiated contact 6 months prior. The arrangement involved moving illicit product through the distribution network for a 20% share of the revenue. Gerald claimed ignorance regarding the product's nature, following instructions for shipment processing and payment routing. Dante's reaction was minimal, but the repetition of Victor Raines's name indicated a significant internal cognitive event, linking the issue to a past conflict. Gerald's motor functions were compromised, as evidenced by his trembling hands while accessing computer files. The data revealed 3 destinations in the Fort District, which he claimed were temporary storage. Dante observed the screen, his tightening jaw a physical tell of his anger upon recognizing the locations as residential addresses. Gerald admitted to a failure of due diligence. Dante confirmed 23 illicit shipments had occurred. He then instructed Lila to document all on-screen evidence with her phone. As Lila photographed the data, Gerald, exhibiting signs of acute distress, inquired about his fate. Dante articulated the terms: a full disclosure of all co-conspirators, followed by an immediate resignation and complete disappearance. The alternative presented was exposure to Victor Rains, a scenario Dante clinically predicted would result in Gerald's termination. He framed this as leveraging Rains's known violent tendencies to ensure his own objective was met. Gerald's complexion shifted from pale to ashen, a sign of extreme fear. Gerald verbalized his fear of being killed, which Dante confirmed with detached objectivity. He positioned the resignation as the logical choice for survival, setting a deadline the following morning. After Layla secured the data, they exited the warehouse. In the vehicle, Layla broke the silence to inquire about Victor Rains. Dante defined him not as a person, but as a former asset who had become a strategic problem, displaying his characteristic emotional detachment. Dante further categorized Rains as an individual who believed he could exploit Dante's infrastructure with impunity. When Layla posited the business involved narcotics, Dante expanded the possibilities to include weapons or human trafficking, noting Victor's lack of specialization beyond profitability. Dante's psychomotor tension was evident in his grip on the wheel. He framed the central conflict as a matter of liability. If authorities discovered the shipments, the legal culpability would fall on him. Dante sharply dismissed the suggestion of involving law enforcement. His rationale revealed a core, narcissistic trait, an unwillingness to subject himself to external investigation and judgment. He articulated the legal principle of owner liability, a fact he claimed Victor was exploiting to shield himself. Should Victor be caught, Dante would be implicated. Layla's query about their next move showed her full enmeshment in the situation. Dante outlined a strategy of proactive intervention to neutralize the threat. Dante's query, "How?" signaled Ms. Bennett's transition from observer to participant. Back at the office after 11, Dante engaged in self-soothing behavior by consuming alcohol. He made a cursory offer of whiskey to Layla, which she declined. He did not insist, instead directing her to display the collected evidence. The analysis began with Layla presenting the documented addresses from her phone while Dante observed. Dante immediately identified the 3 Port District locations as front operations for breaking down bulk shipments into smaller units for local distribution. He assessed that the residential nature of the locations was a tactic to avoid suspicion, exploiting residents likely too intimidated to report activity. He then attempted to reassert control, stating that he would investigate further while she was to be excluded. Layla's protest indicates her resistance to this disengagement. Dante escalated his argument by detailing the specific threat profile of Victor Rains, describing him as intelligent, methodical, and ruthless. This was a form of psychological manipulation meant to frighten her into compliance. He asserted he had capable personnel for the task, dismissing her. His smile was described as genuinely dangerous, a mask-off moment revealing his own predatory capabilities. He challenged her psychological resilience, framing the potential for violence as a reality she could not handle. The subject, Dante, initiated a psychological assessment, questioning Layla's tolerance for environments where violence is a normative outcome. He articulated the shifting legal and ethical boundaries of their work. A somatic stress response was observed in Lila. Her query sought clarification. He explained his rationale for excluding her from covert operations, delineating her skills as analytical rather than tactical. He then directed her to disengage. Her counter-query regarding his intentions was met with a calculatedly vague response. Layla's subsequent statement demonstrated a conflict between her personal ethics and his operational security. He asserted that his methods were his sole concern. Her potential complicity, he argued, was nullified by her report. Her involvement was terminated. He then presented an ultimatum regarding contacting authorities, a tactic to test her loyalty. For 2 months, Layla had observed his meticulous control, and she now processed his unequivocal command to withdraw from a mutually destructive situation. She confirmed she would not report him. He repeated the order. Her compliance was a feint. She proceeded to an apartment, changed into inconspicuous attire, and drove to the target address, which matched her expectations for such a locale. The edifice presented as a 4-story structure in a state of disrepair with clear evidence of prior forced entries. The subject commenced surveillance. After an hour of inactivity, a van arrived. 2 males disembarked and transferred multiple mid-sized containers into the building with practiced efficiency. Layla documented the event, capturing images of the subjects and the vehicle's license plate. The vehicle departed after 20 minutes, and the location returned to a passive state. The subject, Layla, experienced a period of deliberation, weighing the options of reporting her intelligence versus escalating her unauthorized investigation. The rational choice was evident. She opted for the latter. The building's side entrance was secured, but the front was not. The interior showed signs of chronic neglect and theft. She chose the stairs over a non-functional elevator. On the 2nd floor, she noted auditory signs of normal habitation, establishing an ambient baseline. She continued to the 3rd floor, an empty space with olfactory indicators of mold. She moved with deliberate quietude. Apartment 3F was notable for a new high-security lock. Auditory examination revealed nothing. As she aborted her approach, the door was opened by a large male whose appearance suggested extensive experience with physical altercations. He perceived her as an anomaly. Layla deployed a cover story about seeking a friend named Sarah. The subject challenged her stated purpose, which she elaborated on before he flatly denied the existence of any Sarah. As the man advanced, Layla's flight instinct activated. Her escape path was intercepted by a second, younger male who brandished a knife with familiarity. The second subject posed a question. Layla attempted verbal de-escalation. The first subject seized her arm, applying force. He commanded her inside. Her resistance was met with increased pressure, causing sensory loss in her limb. Trapped, she was propelled into apartment 3F before she could vocalize distress. The apartment was sparsely furnished, containing numerous boxes consistent with those from the van. The primary captor initiated interrogation regarding her employer. Her continued denial was met with a physical blow, inducing disorientation and minor injury. Her phone was dislodged and seized by the second captor who discovered the surveillance photos. The interrogator repeated his query. Layla's cognitive process rapidly cycled through survival scenarios, concluding that a claim of acting alone would lack credibility. Assessing that a police affiliation would be fatal, she strategically revealed her connection to Dante Morelli. This name elicited a behavioral pause from both men. The captor sought confirmation. She affirmed the connection, then fabricated a check-in protocol as a survival tactic. After a non-verbal exchange, the primary captor made a phone call reporting the situation. A person from Morelli's office with photos claiming he was aware of her location. Terminating the call, he informed Lila of her detention. Her probe for release was denied. He directed her to a chair, adding that her value to her boss was now her primary asset for survival. For 20 minutes, she was held under watch. Then a third man arrived, whose professional demeanor made the others seem unskilled. He was an older subject, likely in his 50s, with a placid expression that suggested a constricted emotional range. His suit indicated significant wealth. Lila correctly identified him as Victor Rains. Victor's voice was cultured, creating a dissonance with the criminal environment. He classified her actions as an inconvenience. She offered an apology in exchange for release, a proposal he deemed simplistic. He then defined her as either a problem or an opportunity, a subject for his evaluation. Lila attempted to minimize her importance by identifying as a mere assistant. Victor dismissed her self-deprecation, noting Dante Morelli only hires useful individuals. He demanded she specify her utility. Lila, showing physiological stress, stated her role in data analysis. Victor confirmed she found the Apex advisory payments, which she realized exposed her to Dante. He then probed Dante's reaction. Learning of his anger, Victor began to pathologize his rival's preoccupation with a legitimate reputation, framing it as a pretense. Victor's smile was perceived by Lila as more threatening than his neutral expression. He questioned her knowledge of their shared history before offering his own narrative of their origins. He portrayed himself as the architect of Dante's success, rescuing a failing enterprise and consolidating power for which he was promised a partnership. Lila correctly inferred that this partnership no longer existed. Victor cited Dante's stupid decision to legitimize the business as the cause, an act Victor viewed as a hypocritical denial of their violent foundation. Lila maintained a neutral expression. She inquired about his motive. He stated his goal was to expose Dante as a hypocrite whose fortune was built on violence and fear, citing past bodies and the specific case of Marco Morelli's death. Having planted this psychological data, Victor abruptly shifted, stating her confinement was permanent. Lila felt a profound somatic reaction of fear. She countered that her death would implicate him. Victor dismissed this, distinguishing Dante's potential suspicion from actual proof. He stated his objective would be complete before Dante could assemble the facts. Victor issued orders for her confinement, adding the ironic instruction to ensure her comfort. The primary captor again took her arm. Lila's capacity for resistance was exhausted, as she was moved to a small, dark room containing only a mattress and a bucket. The lock engaged, leaving her in isolation. Experiencing neuromuscular weakness, she sat on the mattress and attempted to cognitively process the situation. The subject, Lila, was deprived of communication and completely isolated. Her location was unknown. Subject Dante operated under a false premise of her safety, while the antagonist, Victor Rains, viewed her termination as imminent once her utility as leverage expired. Her thought process devolved into self-recrimination, a common trauma response, attributing her capture to her own actions rather than her captors. She began a tactile exploration of her containment, a futile search for an escape vector. The enclosure was secure, reinforced walls, an externally locked metal door, and an obscured window. A discarded bucket offered no strategic value. A second search of the space yielded only the mattress. She then initiated controlled breathing exercises to suppress a panic response. Victor's mention of an inbound shipment was her sole stimulus. This logistical event signified a potential breach in her containment, representing a singular opportunity to alter her fate. The passage of time became distorted in sensory deprivation. Auditory cues, voices, movement, the shuffling of containers, preceded the sound of the lock disengaging. The sudden influx of light induced temporary photic shock. A silhouetted figure issued a directive. Time to go. Lila rose, attempting to assess the environment beyond her immediate captor. The number of hostiles had increased to 5, possibly 6 individuals. All male subjects fixated on her, their gazes indicating a clear intent to neutralize a perceived threat. Her query of, "Where?" was met with dismissive rhetoric. "Docs. Victor wants this cleaned up properly." Her arm was seized, a consistent method of control for this operative, and she was forcibly moved into the main apartment. The area had been sanitized of all previous furniture and containers. It was now a sterile space, its transient purpose erased. They escorted her outside into the night air, a sensory mix of salt, refuse, and the river. A vehicle was positioned for transport, a black sedan with opaque windows. The rear door was opened, and Dante emerged. His gaze assessed Lila, her handler, and finally Victor Raines, who observed from the building's entrance with an air of narcissistic amusement. "Let her go," Dante stated with low volume. "I don't think so." Victor approached, escalating the confrontation. "See, she possesses value now, evidence of your surveillance, proof you violated our non-interference pact. We have no such agreement, not for 3 years. We operate under an understanding. My illicit activities remain separate from yours." She compromised that understanding by infiltrating my distribution point. "She is not an asset in my business. She is your subordinate, your employee, your liability." Victor's smile was predatory. "The scenario will proceed as follows. You will disengage from this confrontation, cease your investigation of Meridian, and halt all inquiry into my operations. Her survival is contingent on your compliance." Dante's expression remained a flat affect, but his posture shifted, signaling a change in tactical readiness. "If you harm her, no sanctuary will conceal you." A grandiose threat from an operative outnumbered 6 to 1. "You assume my arrival was unsupported?" Victor's composure showed a minor fracture. He scanned the area past Dante, searching for unseen threats. At that moment, the situation destabilized. The initial gunshot originated from an unseen position. The operative holding Lila exhibited a reflexive spasm and collapsed, his grip failing. She did not hesitate, but moved toward Dante, identifying him as the only point of stability in the sudden chaos. He secured her, repositioning her behind him while drawing a firearm from his jacket. This display of overt armament was a novel stimulus for Lila, creating a profound cognitive dissonance. The man she associated with administrative tasks now stood as a shield against lethal violence, inducing a state of mental vertigo. Victor's operatives dispersed, seeking cover as the street became a live fire zone, a chaotic reality far removed from dramatized portrayals. The auditory assault was intense, punctuated by the sounds of ballistic impacts against metal and the shattering of glass. "Stay down," Dante commanded, his tone paradoxically calm amid the cacophony. Lila assumed a low-profile position behind the sedan, attempting to mitigate sensory overload. Unidentified Allied combatants materialized from the periphery, flanking Victor's cohort with tactical precision indicative of a planned engagement. Victor himself had retreated behind a concrete support, issuing commands that were largely lost in the exchange of fire. One of his men attempting to flee was neutralized by an unknown assailant. A second hostile went down. incapacitated by a wound to his leg. Dante discharged his weapon twice, 2 controlled shots, and a scream followed. Then, an abrupt cessation of hostilities. The subsequent silence was more jarring than the preceding gunfire, leaving a residue of tinnitus and the smell of cordite. From behind the vehicle, she observed Dante, still standing, weapon at low ready. His assessment of the scene was as dispassionate as a quarterly review. 4 of Victor's men were down. 2 showed no signs of life. 2 others were injured and audibly in distress. The remaining 2 had surrendered, their weapons discarded. Victor remained concealed but silent. "Emerge," Dante commanded, "or my assets will extract you. I assure you that option is less favorable." After a tense pause, Victor revealed himself with his hands partially raised, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "A considerable display, Dante. I underestimated your residual capacity for such actions. A miscalculation on your part." Dante advanced, his weapon still presented. "On your knees. I don't think." "On your knees, Victor, or I will place you there." Victor's jaw muscles tensed, but he complied, soiling his expensive suit on the pavement. His facade dissolved, replaced by an expression of pure animosity. Dante halted a few feet away. "You made 3 errors tonight. First, you assumed I was oblivious to the misuse of my infrastructure. Second, you believed I would be indifferent. Third, you concluded you could threaten someone under my aegis without consequence. She infiltrated my operation. A strategic falsehood, delivered with utter conviction. I sent her. She was a probe, sent to confirm the foolish extent of your activities within my warehouses and to provide justification for subsequent actions." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Which are what?" "That is contingent upon your cooperation." Dante signaled an associate, who moved in with zip ties to restrain Victor. "You will provide a full intelligence download. Every location, every shipment, every operative on your payroll. Then you will dismantle this network and vacate this city. You're delusional if you think—" Dante crouched, meeting Victor's eye level. "Do you recall Marco?" A visible stillness overcame Victor. "My brother," Dante continued, his voice low and lethal, "deceased for 5 years. The official report cited a car accident. Brake failure, a tragedy. Except it was no accident, was it, Victor? I am unaware of—" "Don't!" The word was a scalpel. "I have spent 5 years substantiating what I already knew. You orchestrated Marco's death because he discovered your financial malfeasance. You feared his disclosure to me. You gambled that my grief would incapacitate my analytical faculties." Victor's complexion became ashen. "Dante, you must understand." "I understand with perfect clarity. You murdered my brother. You exploited my corporation for your criminal enterprise. And tonight you targeted an individual for whom I hold some degree of attachment." Dante stood. "Therefore, the protocol is as follows. You will provide total compliance. You will surrender all data required to neutralize your infrastructure. In return, I will grant you a sufficient window to flee before your demise. And if I decline—" Dante cycled the action of his firearm, chambering around. "Then I will bypass the intermediate steps and conclude this matter now." Lila observed from her position of cover, her tachycardia persisting as she processed the new intelligence. Marco's death was a targeted assassination, a fact Dante had harbored for 5 years. Her entire psychological construct of Dante Morelli underwent a radical realignment, shifting from a blurred impression to a sharp, unsettling image. Victor stared at Dante, and a visible psychological collapse occurred. "Fine. You require intel?" I will provide it, but not in this location. You will provide it precisely where I dictate. Dante gestured to his men. Transport him to the facility. Ms. Bennett and I are en route. 2 operatives hoisted Victor to his feet, moving him toward a newly arrived van. Victor's injured men were being loaded into a separate vehicle, while the 2 who surrendered were being processed. Dante addressed Lila. Are you injured? She gestured no, unable to speak. Can you move? Yes. Acceptable. Enter the vehicle. Layla complied, her limbs trembling as she entered the sedan. Dante sat beside her as an unfamiliar male operative took the wheel, departing the location with the calculated calm of a routine extraction, not a retreat from a violent confrontation. The facility, Layla articulated after several blocks. What is it? A controlled environment for conversation. You intend to question him? Affirmatively. Dante, if you cause him harm is a necessary component. Dante's gaze was unyielding. Victor is responsible for Marco's death. He has embezzled from my organization for months, and his objective tonight was your termination. Therefore, yes, harm is the intended outcome. You can either process that fact or exhaust the duration of this transit attempting to present a superior alternative. Layla's throat constricted. There must be a different protocol. The police, federal agents, an entity that would subject me to the same level of scrutiny as him, one that would excavate every link between my current enterprises and their origins, an agency that would leverage this incident to dismantle the structure I have built. Dante's tone was modulated, but a sharp edge had emerged. I have stated this previously, Layla. The legal system does not shield individuals like me, it preys on us. Victor understands this, which is why he exploited my infrastructure. His capture ensures my own. But if you execute him, I did not state my intent was to kill him. I stated my intent was to harm him. The distinction is significant. The differentiation offered Layla no comfort, but she ceased her objections. The effort was futile. She had entered this dynamic by her own volition. She had defied Dante's explicit directive to remain uninvolved. Now she was a clinical observer of the consequences. The facility was a warehouse within an industrial sector that appeared derelict for decades. The interior matched Layla's projections. Concrete flooring, steel racks, basic furniture, and illumination that created severe, distorting shadows. Victor was present, positioned on a chair in the center of the room, his wrists still bound by zip ties. He appeared somehow reduced, his previous veneer of confident composure stripped away. Dante entered, removed his coat, and prepared his arms as if for strenuous work. An associate provided him with a file. This, Dante began, opening it, is the data I already possess on your operation. 23 unsanctioned shipments via Meridian over 6 months. 3 distribution hubs in the port zone. Financial transfers of over $600,000 laundered through shell corporations. My informational deficit relates to the product's origin, the identity of your clientele, and the network's total depth. And you believe I will volunteer this information? Victor's tone was defiant, but Layla detected the underlying fear. I believe you will provide it, because the alternative is demonstrably worse. Dante positioned a chair opposite Victor. This is my proposition. Absolute cooperation from you in return for a 12-hour grace period before I alert certain parties that you have been operating within their territory without sanction. This provides time for you to flee, to vanish, to reestablish yourself elsewhere, but only upon delivering everything I require. And my alternative? In that scenario, I will ensure every criminal entity in this metropolis is aware you have been siphoning their supply lines while using my company as a shield. Your life expectancy becomes 48 hours, and I will be marginally inconvenienced by the subsequent cleanup. Victor's expression cycled through a spectrum of states: rage, analysis, terror, and finally, capitulation. You are bluffing. Am I? Dante settled back. You have studied me, Victor. You know I do not issue threats I am unprepared to execute. So select your outcome. Assist me in a clean termination of this problem, or expire with the knowledge that your only accomplishment was complicating my affairs for several months. The silence intensified. Positioned near the entrance, Layla observed, feeling as though she had entered a subculture governed by a logic she could not comprehend and had no desire to internalize. At last, Victor conceded. The product was sourced through Newark. It arrived on container vessels listed as textiles and machine components. My asset there would divert select containers prior to customs, and I would arrange their transport to Meridian for processing. Synthesis identified the asset. Victor supplied a name unfamiliar to Layla. Dante recorded it. The buyers? Low-level distributors primarily, individuals seeking to move product without the encumbrance of major syndicates. I maintained the transactions at a small, frequent, and untraceable level. The number of buyers? 30, perhaps 40. A complete list was never maintained. It was too great a liability. Dante's expression remained impassive. That is false. Your organizational patterns preclude such a lack of record keeping. Where is the data? Victor wavered. It is digital, encrypted, on a server with remote access. Access it. One of Dante's men produced a laptop. Victor, still restrained, awkwardly entered a web address and password. A file system appeared, populated with folders bearing coded identifiers. Dante analyzed the display. This constitutes your entire network? All components of significance? Good. Dante signaled his operative, who then copied the data to a storage device. What else? That is the totality of the operation I ran through your facilities. Let's discuss Marco. Victor's complexion became pallid. What of him? Who was the direct agent who altered his vehicle? Dante. That incident was 5 years ago. Respond to the query. Victor shut his eyes. A mechanic, Torres. He had a debt to me. I offered to clear it for a single task. He was unaware of the vehicle's owner. He simply followed the protocol. His current location? Deceased. A fatal overdose 2 years ago. I had no involvement in that. Dante remained silent for a considerable period. Did Marco experience pain? What? When the brakes failed. In the moment he understood the crash was inevitable. Was it prolonged or was it instantaneous? Victor's voice was nearly inaudible. I don't know. Dante rose, moved away, then pivoted back, striking Victor with enough force to overturn the chair, causing Victor to impact the concrete floor. Layla recoiled. Dante loomed over the downed man. His breathing labored, his hand likely fractured from the impact. That is for Marco, for forcing me to spend 5 years questioning my own failures, for removing the sole member of my family who was not invested in my ruin. Victor was bleeding from the mouth. his gaze unfocused. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "No, you are not. You regret being apprehended." Dante composed himself, flexing his injured hand with a wince. "Remove him from my sight, transport him to the state border, and abandon him. If he is ever seen in this city again, he is terminated." Two operatives lifted Victor and moved him toward an exit. He showed no resistance, offered no words, and allowed himself to be handled like an inanimate object. After they left, Dante collapsed into the now empty chair, placing his head in his hands. Lila moved toward him cautiously. "Is your hand fractured?" "It's probable. It requires medical attention. Later." He looked at her, and for the first time she had known him, he appeared depleted. Truly and profoundly depleted. "You should not have been at that building." "I am aware." "You could have been terminated." "I am aware." "And you proceeded nonetheless. The motive?" Layla took the seat across from him. "Because your intent was to manage this in isolation, and I believed. I am unsure what I believed. That you might require support, that I could provide assistance." "You did assist. You identified the anomalies, tracked the finances, gave me sufficient cause to engage Victor, but you persisted and nearly forfeited your life as a result." "I apologize." "Do not apologize. Simply—" He paused, appearing to recalibrate his response. "Do not repeat the behavior." "I will not." They remained in silence for a minute. Then Layla posed the question that had been forming since the initial confrontation. "Your brother, Marco, what was his character?" Dante's expression morphed into something that might be identified as grief had he permitted its full manifestation. "He was intelligent, overly intelligent for the family enterprise, yet loyal enough to remain within it. He consistently attempted to persuade me to transition to legitimate operations, to repurpose our father's foundation into something that would not result in our deaths or incarceration. I dismissed his views as naive." "But you ultimately did so." "Following his death. Following Victor's assassination of him." "Correct." "Because Marco's assessment was accurate. The empire our father constructed was toxic to all who engaged with it, adversaries, associates, and family alike. It was merely a matter of time before it consumed me as well." Dante stood, nursing his injury. "So I began the transition, methodically, cautiously, divesting from operations too illicit to be defended, constructing legitimate corporations. It required 3 years to achieve a level of legitimacy where my dealings were not automatically presumed to be criminal. And now Victor has attempted to pull you back into that world." "Victor never supported my exit. He preferred the old methodology, the violence, the intimidation, the power. When I severed our association, he perceived it as a personal offense." Dante headed for the door. "Let's go. We must get ahead of this situation before those distribution points are discovered and inquiries begin." The return to the city was conducted in a state of nonverbal tension. The emergent dawn, with its palette of gray and pink, presented a stark, almost offensive contrast to the night's traumatic events. The subject, Layla, exhibited classic symptoms of acute stress reaction. Somatic aches from prolonged hypervigilance and intrusive repetitive thoughts of the preceding violence. At their base of operations, the primary subject, Dante, immediately engaged in containment protocols, methodically neutralizing threats to his enterprise. His actions were clinical, contacting port authorities, alerting property management to unauthorized usage, and deploying legal assets to frame his corporation as the defrauded party. By midday, a meticulously crafted false narrative was established. The official account stated that Meridian's manager operated an illicit scheme without corporate awareness. The responsible parties were reportedly managed internally, preempting law enforcement involvement. Morelli Enterprises positioned itself as fully cooperative with all inquiries, citing the implementation of new security protocols. The construct was seamless, professional, and patently false. It was, however, designed to withstand scrutiny, bolstered by the 3 years Dante had invested in cultivating a facade of legitimacy. "You possess a high degree of skill in this," Lila noted, observing his final call. "In what?" he inquired. "In the retro-causal restructuring of events, creating the appearance of non-involvement." "My non-involvement is factual. Victor exploited my company without my consent. That is the truth. But you were aware of the possibility for 2 months. I held a suspicion. Substantiation was absent until your discovery." Dante assumed a posture of repose. "Herein lies the distinction between involvement and victimhood. Victims elicit sympathy, perpetrators elicit investigation. And you are classified as what? A victim?" Dante's gaze remained fixed on her for an extended moment. "I am an individual attempting to construct a legitimate entity from the remnants of a corrupt one. This necessitates a careful curation of which truths are disclosed and which are managed. You are not required to approve, but you must comprehend it to continue your function here. And if I find that untenable, then your employment is terminated and our respective paths diverge." Lila processed this ultimatum against the backdrop of the prior 12 hours. The overt violence, the psychological manipulation, the calculated precision with which Dante orchestrated Victor's demise while securing his own absolution. This clinical display of sociopathy should have triggered a flight response, compelling her to report her findings to federal authorities. It failed to do so. Underlying the pathological behaviors, she perceived a distorted form of justice, a man avenging a familial death, assuming significant risk to protect his organization and its personnel. He had retrieved her from a situation of capture, an objectively illogical and high-risk action when abandonment offered greater security. "I am remaining," she declared. Dante inclined his head, a gesture indicating the confirmation of an expected outcome. "Affirmative. There is a substantial workload ahead." The subsequent 2 weeks were dedicated to a systematic sanitization of Victor's operational footprint. Distribution hubs were neutralized and returned. The Newark shipping containers were intercepted, their contents cataloged for the authorities. Victor's client list received discreet notifications of a supply chain compromise, advising them to seek new procurement channels. Dante managed the entire process with the controlled precision that defined all his endeavors, delegating, controlling information flow, and ensuring every liability was neutralized before it could manifest. Observing his methodology, Lila began to develop a clinical understanding of his empire's architecture. It was not constructed solely on fear, although fear was a significant component. It was built on ruthless efficiency, on the principle that any problem has a soluble point given the correct application of resources. It was based on knowing the precise moment for brutality versus strategic maneuvering. Concurrently, she began a reevaluation of her own psyche. The impulse that drove her to expose fraud at Morrison and Hecht had not vanished. It was merely being rechanneled. Instead of reporting anomalies to external systems of justice, she was now complicit in resolving them through a clandestine, internal apparatus. The lack of cognitive dissonance this produced was, in itself, a noteworthy symptom. One evening, 3 weeks after the confrontation, Dante summoned her to his office. It was late, past 2100 hours, and the structure was largely deserted. A bottle of whiskey and 2 tumblers were on his desk. "A drink?" he offered. I previously stated my disinclination. Regarded as a commemoration, we are officially absolved. The authorities have terminated their inquiry into Meridian. Victor has not been cited since his release. Furthermore, our quarterly financials show a net positive, as we are no longer hemorrhaging capital via fraudulent consulting fees. Lila took a seat and accepted the glass. "What is your assessment of his location?" "Victor, South America, most likely. A region with relaxed extradition treaties and a depressed real estate market. He will eventually reconstitute his operations, but not in this territory. And should he return? He will not." Dante ingested a small amount of the liquor. "He is aware that a return would compel me to complete the initial action, and the next attempt will not be preceded by warnings." They sat in a shared silence. Then Dante made an unexpected statement. "Thank you." Lila looked up. "For what?" "Oh, for identifying the financial anomalies, for demonstrating the persistence to continue despite my directives to cease, for," he paused, selecting his words with clinical care, "for not fleeing when faced with the authentic nature of this environment." I considered flight on several occasions, but the action was not taken. That holds significance. He replenished both glasses. "I was sincere in my prior statement. I do not retain personnel unless they provide utility. However, your status has evolved beyond useful, Ms. Bennett. You have become necessary." Layla perceived a physiological response, a flush of heat to her face, and attempted to suppress it. "I am merely executing my professional duties." "You are exceeding them. You are assisting me in building an enterprise that may possess long-term viability, something Marco would have endorsed." Dante's expression underwent a subtle relaxation. "He would have appreciated your psychological profile, specifically your refusal to retreat from difficult lines of inquiry." "I regret not having the opportunity to meet him." "As do I." Dante rose and moved to the window, observing the city's illumination. "I spent 5 years in a state of sustained anger. At Victor, at myself, at a chaotic universe for eliminating Marco, the sole moral agent in our family unit. That anger induced a state of caution. It compelled my transition away from the activities that led to his death, but it also induced a state of emotional detachment. I repelled anyone who achieved proximity because proximity equates to vulnerability." He turned to face her again. "You have compromised that defensive posture." Layla's cardiovascular rate was accelerating beyond baseline. "What are you communicating?" "I am communicating that at some point between the destruction of my Voss and your near death, while investigating my company, I developed a vested interest in your continued survival. This introduces a complication." "Complication?" Layla echoed. "I am your employer. You are my subordinate. A power differential exists that renders any further development inappropriate at minimum and predatory at maximum. And yet," he paused, appearing to weigh his next words with precision, "and yet I find my thoughts occupied by you to an excessive degree, wondering about your opinions on matters unrelated to our work, desiring to know you in capacities that have no bearing on your ability to analyze financial data. Layla placed her glass down, her hands exhibiting tremors. Dante, it is not necessary to articulate this. I am not making a request. I am providing an honest assessment, because after the sum of our shared experiences, you are entitled to honesty. She stood, circumnavigated the desk, and halted several feet from him, close enough to observe the fine detail of a scar near his eyebrow, close enough to detect the scent of whiskey and the expensive fragrance he habitually wore. I have also been thinking about you, she stated quietly, in ways entirely unrelated to professional duties. And it is terrifying, given your identity and my own, and the high probability that this is the single most ill-advised course of action for either of us. Probably, Dante concurred, but I have no desire to cease thinking about it. Nor do I. They remained in position for a moment, the interpersonal tension palpable. Then Dante extended his uninjured hand slowly, affording her every chance to withdraw, and made contact with her face. His thumb traced her zygomatic arch, a gentle gesture that stood in stark contradiction to her entire psychological profile of him. Instruct me to stop, he said. No. He initiated a kiss. It was tentative at first, as if testing the reality of the moment or her potential to vanish under pressure. But upon her reciprocation, a palpable shift occurred and the contact deepened into something that felt preordained. When they broke apart, both exhibiting labored breathing, Dante rested his forehead against hers. This alters the entire dynamic, he stated. I am aware. There will be discourse. It will be said you used seduction for advancement, that I am exploiting my position. Let them engage in discourse. Oh, Layla, I am not concerned with public opinion. She pulled back enough to establish direct eye contact. I am concerned with this, with you, with whatever this is evolving into. All else is extraneous data. Dante smiled, and for the first time it appeared genuine, reaching his eyes. You will be my ruin. Probably, she replied, mirroring his earlier response. But it will at least be interesting. They maintained discretion for 3 months, a feat that, in retrospect, was impressive, given the office environment's propensity for exposing secrets. Claire became aware within 2 weeks. Layla deduced this from the receptionist's shift in expression, from professional neutrality to something approaching clinical approval, though with Claire, accurate interpretation was always difficult. The staff's suspicion, though delayed, inevitably surfaced. Speculative glances followed Layla's summons to Dante's office, questioning the atypical expansion of her professional duties. Layla's attempt at indifference was a noted yet failed coping mechanism. The prevalent hypothesis is that your promotion was predicated on our intimate involvement, Dante stated in his apartment, their chosen sanctuary from observation. Is that assessment inaccurate? Layla queried from the couch, engrossed in a financial brief and wearing his shirt. A clear marker of intimacy. Logically, no. Temporally, yes. Your professional merit preceded this arrangement. Arrangement? Layla echoed, seeking a concrete label. Is that our working definition? Dante paused his own task. What term do you propose? Something less provisional, something that validates its existence. He put his laptop aside and joined her. It exists. I am simply uncertain of a label that is not either dismissive or presumptuous. Relationship? Acceptable. Good. Layla returned to her analysis, but he removed it from her grasp. A separate matter requires discussion, he said. That preface rarely precedes positive developments. It isn't negative, merely complex. His careful word selection signaled the gravity of his next statement. There is an unresolved variable in the Victor scenario, a liability that will manifest if not neutralized. Layla exhibited a physiological stress response. Identify the variable. His clientele, the buyers cataloged on his server, most were small-scale, but a few were affiliates of larger syndicates. These organizations will demand an explanation for the supply disruption. Can you not simply... I don't know. Inform them Victor is defunct and to secure new vendors. That communication was sent 3 weeks ago. The majority complied, but 2 entities continue to probe Victor's abrupt disappearance. One possesses links to my father's former associates. Layla's posture became rigid. What are the implications? They have sufficient knowledge of my history to harbor suspicion. They question if I have reverted to my previous persona. Dante rose and moved to the window. Meeting is scheduled for tomorrow evening. Neutral ground. Nominally a conversation, but such talks carry implicit demands. What sort of demands? That I either substitute for Victor's supply network or provide a compelling rationale for my refusal. And the consequence of failing to convince them. They will conclude I engineered Victor's removal to seize his operation. This will precipitate either a partnership overture or an attempt to eliminate me as a competitor. Layla's anxiety became palpable. You cannot attend alone. I will not. Marcus and Leo will be present. He turned to face her. I am disclosing this because of the potential for complications. Should an adverse event occur, you must know the corporate contingency. No adverse event will occur. The probability is low, but I no longer operate on assumptions of safety. He returned to the couch sitting beside her. The corporate structure dictates that in my absence, control transfers to a board I have selected. You were appointed last week. Claire holds the records. Dante! This is not melodrama. It is preparedness. There is a distinction. He took her hand. You have contributed to this company's development as much as I. You have earned a voice in its future should I be unable to lead it. You will be able to. That is the intention. But intentions do not guarantee outcomes. She suppressed the urge to dismiss his concerns as paranoia, recognizing it as advanced risk assessment in his world. Acknowledged, she said. But upon your return tomorrow, our conversation will shift. We will discuss a mundane topic, like dinner plans, or the color of these melancholic gray walls. Dante offered a faint smile. Agreed. The following night, Layla waited in his apartment, her attempt to work proving futile. The meeting was set for 9 o'clock. It was 10:30. Her phone remained silent despite 2 text messages. At 11 o'clock, she called Marcus, his security chief. He is functional. Marcus stated preemptively, the meeting is prolonged. He will contact you upon its conclusion. Define functional, viable, unharmed, and engaged in difficult negotiations. The counterparty is creating delays. How difficult? The type necessitating patience, not tactical support. Trust me, Ms. Bennett, a problematic development would have been communicated to you. Layla disconnected, attempting to rely on Marcus's assessment. She managed another 40 minutes before her phone rang. I am en route, Dante began. The situation is resolved. What does resolved entail? It entails my convincing them I am not and never will be in their line of commerce. They were displeased, but conceded. Is that all? They just conceded? I may have offered financial restitution for the inconvenience of Victor's removal and clarified that further inquiries would negatively impact their well-being. Gods, Dante. It is concluded, Lila. That is the salient point. Vehicular noise was audible. My arrival is in 20 minutes. Then we will have the normal conversation you requested. He arrived in 18 minutes, appearing fatigued, but physically sound. Layla's embrace at the door was more forceful than protocol would suggest. I am unharmed, he murmured into her hair. I know. Marcus informed me. The waiting was still intolerable. Acclimate yourself. This is an element of being with me. Layla pulled back. Being with you? Is that our current terminology? Unless you offer a superior one. No, that one is sufficient. Her kiss was an analysis of whiskey and an unidentifiable secondary compound. But I insist on the normal conversation. No further business discussion tonight. No more talk of potential threats. Only us. They ordered a meal that grew cold from neglect. They viewed a film that neither processed. They lost consciousness on the couch, physically entwined in a posture promising future discomfort but providing immediate solace. For one evening, Dante Morelli was not a former syndicate head building a legitimate enterprise. He was merely a man who laughed at inappropriate moments, noted Layla's cold feet, and held her as if she were an asset to be guarded. It was the most normative evening Layla had known in months, fostering hope for their viability. The true evaluation occurred 6 weeks later when the FBI arrived at Morelli Enterprises with inquiries about Meridian Holdings. Layla was at her desk as 2 agents, whose attire projected their federal affiliation, bypassed Claire and approached Dante's office. She rose to intervene, but his door was already opening. Gentlemen, Dante said, his tone of polite cooperation signaling his anticipation of this event. Please, come in. Ms. Bennett, defer my calls. The door shut. Layla sat, feigning work as her heart rate accelerated. The narrative they had fabricated was structurally sound. She knew this from her role in its construction. Yet its challenge by federal authorities was a different stressor than a theoretical exercise. 45 minutes later, the agents departed. They seemed dissatisfied, but not prepared to make arrests. Dante appeared in his doorway moments later. My office, he commanded. Layla took her tablet and followed him in. He closed the door and sat with noticeable weight. They are aware of Victor, he stated. To what extent? That he managed an operation via Meridian and vanished concurrently with our reports of unauthorized resource use. Their objective is to ascertain if I was complicit in his disappearance or a victim of his malfeasance. What was your statement? The truth. That my assistant uncovered accounting irregularities. That our internal investigation revealed Gerald Renton was facilitating an unsanctioned operation. That we dismissed Renton and reported our conclusions. That Victor Raines was Renton's external contact and absconded before he could be interrogated. Did they find it credible? They remain suspicious, but suspicion is not evidence, which they lack due to our meticulous planning. Dante looked at her. They will want to interview you, likely tomorrow. They will inquire about your findings, the timeline, and any indication I had prior knowledge. Layla's mouth felt arid. What is my testimony? The truth. You discovered discrepancies during a standard audit. You reported them to me without delay. I initiated an investigation and terminated the responsible parties. Do not editorialize. Do not speculate. Do not attempt to shield me with fabrications. Recount the events precisely, including the part where I entered that building against your direct order. Especially that part. It confirms your autonomous actions, providing exculpatory evidence against any claim of collusion on your part. The male subject's strategy was consistent with his pattern of cold calculation, yet the female subject expressed moral conflict. When she questioned its viability, he shifted tactics. He instructed her to accept any immunity deal offered for testimony against him, framing it as a clinical necessity to protect her from the consequences of his own actions, thereby overriding her autonomy. His ultimatum was a clear exertion of control. In response, she verbalized a declaration of love, a statement made under extreme duress. The male subject, Dante, pathologized her emotional disclosure, labeling it a poor rationale for perjury. She clarified her intent to be truthful, reiterating the unconditional nature of her attachment, a classic symptom of trauma bonding. Lila attempted to absolve him of the need for reciprocity. She asserted that his isolation was a shared burden which prompted a physical response, a kiss indicative of both desperation and relief. He reciprocated her declaration of love, but immediately attached a condition. She must prioritize self-preservation over loyalty. Her counteroffer was to make a context-dependent choice. He registered this defiance with a smile, acknowledging her intractable nature. Federal interrogation of Lila commenced the following day in an environment designed for psychological pressure. The subject recounted a sanitized version of events, omitting details of her abduction and extra-legal interrogation. These omissions were a calculated effort to maintain credibility by excluding elements that were unverifiable and could suggest complicity. The interrogators noted her testimony without providing feedback. Their final line of inquiry targeted her romantic involvement with Dante, a standard tactic to establish motive. She confirmed the relationship, dating its start to a period 3 months prior, after the internal investigation had concluded. My role was his assistant. Proximity was a job requirement, she stated. When questioned if their relationship influenced her reporting, she denied it, citing the standard corporate chain of command as her sole motivation. Following the interview, Lila reported feeling as if she had undergone an examination with delayed, high-stakes consequences. She relayed the agent's line of questioning about their relationship to Dante. She recounted her testimony, confirming she maintained the established timeline. When she solicited his assessment of her credibility, he noted that their relationship provided the authorities with a motive to question her honesty. Dante articulated that without proof of their prior involvement, any such claim was mere speculation. 2 weeks later, the investigation was closed without indictment, though official correspondence recommended stronger internal oversight protocols. The resolution was nominal, as significant collateral damage had occurred. Board resignations and terminated client contracts reflected a loss of confidence. The stock value of public subsidiaries declined 12%. Dante analyzed the damage reports with characteristic clinical detachment, predicting recovery through redoubled effort. Lila inquired about the timeline, which he estimated at 6 months to a year. His immediate strategy was to aggressively project an image of legitimacy. Observing the data, Lila proposed a philanthropic initiative, a foundation. Dante initially hesitated, then recognized the strategic value of such an entity for rehabilitating their public image. Lila reframed the objective, stating the primary motivation was to create a meaningful legacy in honor of an individual named Marco, not merely reputational repair. Dante conceded, noting Marco's own philosophy of constructive rather than destructive family endeavors. Thus, the Marco Morelli Foundation was conceived, focusing on scholarships for disadvantaged youth in business. The project served as an effective tool for shifting public perception of Dante and his corporate entity. The workload was extreme, yet amid the stress, a notable psychological shift occurred. Dante began exhibiting reduced hypervigilance, displaying uncharacteristic behaviors such as spontaneous smiling. He sanctioned a weekend of complete disengagement from work. At a remote location, he verbalized a newfound state of mind, a cessation of anticipating imminent disaster. He expressed a novel belief in the possibility of a positive outcome. Lila affirmed their current stability and the Foundation's success. Dante's agreement signaled an unfamiliar but accepted state of psychological well-being. 6 months post-investigation, at the Foundation's inaugural ceremony, 20 scholarships were awarded. Dante delivered a public address about his brother, displaying an uncharacteristic level of emotional honesty. He spoke of Marco's belief in second chances. Lila observed from a distance, experiencing a complex emotional response of pride and relief at their survival. Post-ceremony, a scholarship recipient expressed gratitude to Dante. He deflected the praise, reframing the scholarship as a facilitator for her own agency, and imposed a condition of future reciprocity. The interaction seemed to induce a state of peace in him. He remarked that Marco would have approved of the event, a sentiment with which Lila concurred. They observed the celebration, a moment that underscored the significant psychological distance both had traveled. Their dynamic had evolved from initial conflict to constructive partnership. Deficits remained in their interactions, conflicts over boundaries and unilateral decision-making. His past continued to be a significant stressor on their attempts to build a stable future. Despite these persistent issues, their continued effort was a notable prognostic indicator. 1 year later, Dante initiated a proposal of marriage. The act was devoid of traditional romantic ceremony, presented as a logical conclusion following a stressful business meeting. Lila responded with laughter at the clinical nature of his proposal. He affirmed his seriousness, articulating a desire to build a life with her that transcended their professional and business entanglements. "Something that is ours," the subject stated, setting aside her device to occupy his lap, a deliberate disruption of his ordered environment that elicited a positive response. "Yes," she affirmed. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, despite your flawed proposal methodology and chronic inability to disengage from work. These are accurate assessments. I am marrying you regardless." 6 months later, the union was formalized in a non-traditional ceremony at the Foundation's community center. Attended by a small cohort, Claire was present, her expression verging on approval. Subject Dante's behavioral shift was noted. A peer observed a transition from violent resolutions to occasional verbal negotiation. Lila's parents exhibited significant cognitive dissonance, struggling to process their daughter's union with an individual on a federal watch list. The partnership was characterized by instability, yet achieved a functional, if unconventional, equilibrium. The subsequent years required persistent effort to transition a criminal enterprise into a legitimate one, encountering social stigma and heightened regulatory scrutiny from competitors and authorities. Positive outcomes were also documented. The philanthropic foundation expanded, aiding numerous students. The business entered new markets, establishing relationships based on trust, a departure from previous methods of intimidation. Dante's public persona evolved from that of a crime figure to a reformed businessman facilitating second chances. After 2 years, Lila assumed the COO role, a position her competency validated against accusations of nepotism. She restructured company operations for greater efficiency and transparency, becoming the public advocate for their foundation's mission to break socio-economic cycles of crime. They acquired a single-family residence, facilitating cohabitation and professional autonomy. A canine was introduced, toward which Dante displayed performative annoyance masking clear attachment. Their dyad navigated conflict and resolution, solidifying their partnership. 5 years after their initial meeting, Lila observed the Foundation's new headquarters, a renovated structure in a revitalized area. She examined a display of case files, photographic evidence of scholarship beneficiaries and their subsequent successes, a visual record of the program's efficacy. Dante articulated their shared achievement, stating, "We did this." Lila acknowledged the outcome deviated from her life projections, qualifying it as superior. He initiated physical contact, confessing a prior belief that redemption was unattainable for individuals with his history. He credited her with disproving this conviction. Lila corrected the attribution to a shared effort, noting his own desire for change was a necessary precondition. He conceded his motivation stemmed from her positive appraisal of his character, which acted as a catalyst for his own self-reassessment. Lila posed a question about the most valuable aspect of their progress. She answered her own query, defining it as their ongoing process of development, trial, and error, a state she termed real and preferable to perfect. Dante responded with a prolonged kiss, a public display of affection within the Foundation, surrounded by evidence of behavioral rehabilitation. Post-embrace, Lila identified a young man exhibiting anxiety near the entrance, a behavior reminiscent of her own past state. The individual confirmed he was present for a mentorship interview, and Lila guided him inward. Later, in their domestic setting, Dante made an unprecedented statement of emotional contentment. "I'm happy." Lila sought confirmation in the low light. He elaborated that for the first time in his memory, he was not anticipating a negative event. She affirmed his right to this emotional state, and her own. She then listed his minor domestic failings, which he acknowledged. In turn, he recognized her compulsive organizational tendencies and intrusive investigative habits, which she admitted were ongoing. When questioned on her progress, she confessed to a recent transgression, which elicited laughter from Dante. They entered sleep in physical contact within a shared residence, symbolizing a life constructed from past trauma and rehabilitation. This outcome is not a storybook conclusion. No guarantee of perpetual stability exists. They will face future stressors and regressions, but possess a strong interpersonal bond and a foundation demonstrably altering lives. All built on principles superseding coercion, they possessed empirical evidence that personality modification is possible, that attachment can form under adverse conditions, and that volatile and regulated impulses can coexist. Ultimately, this state of being was deemed sufficient. It was for this a complete psychological resolution.